It's that time of the week for us to delve into all of the ways that legacy media gets it wrong with friend of the show, Katie Halper, host of The Katie Halper Show and co-host of the Useful Idiots podcast. Always great to see you, Katie.
You too.
This week, we're looking at how big media outlets appear to be blacklisting the Steven Donziger case. The lawyer is under house arrest for charges he says are a result of his battle with oil giant Chevron, and he's right.
Independent journalist Spencer Snyder breaks this down really well. Let's take a look.
Steven Donziger, the environmental lawyer who helped win a $9.5 billion judgment against Chevron, has been under house arrest for about 2 years, essentially as punishment. And although he is all over independent media, he seems to have been basically blacklisted from corporate and mainstream media. Here is the single segment from Bloomberg pertaining to Donziger.
Donziger, who is a New York plaintiff's lawyer who represents thousands of poor farmers and indigenous tribe members in the rainforest, is literally being followed by the private eyes hired by Chevron because the stakes in this case, billions and billions of dollars, are so high. Chevron became convinced that Donziger was running not a lawsuit against the oil company, but a corporate shakedown.
So, Katie, what's going on with this? Why is the media not touching this story?
I mean, I think it's kind of incredible, honestly, that they're not. I think it's also a shockingly newsworthy story. And I think that this is, though, what happens when you have some really powerful company that's basically, I mean, I wouldn't want to touch it if I were legacy media because I wouldn't want to lose my access and I wouldn't want to be like hounded. Luckily, I'm not big enough to I think, for Chevron to waste their time persecuting me or trying to put me under house arrest. But it's just, I mean, it's like media malpractice. I just don't understand how this story cannot be newsworthy. And you have foreign journalists, you have people flying in to talk to Donziger, but somehow when it's legacy media, they ignore it.
And it is a really incredible story, Katie. We've covered it here at Rising, covered it at The Intercept a significant amount.
Right.
But can you talk a little bit about the substance of the story, because for people that aren't quite cynical enough yet,
sure.
They might not even believe that such a thing is possible.
Yeah, I mean, it is incredible. So what you have is someone who went after Chevron, right, and won a record, unprecedented judgment, $9.5 billion against Chevron. And what Chevron did, and as you said, this is actually true. This is what they did. They intentionally poisoned basically the areas of the Amazon in Ecuador. And again, $9.5 billion, right? And this is a good, I think, sense of how outrageous the treatment of Donziger is. So then Chevron, I wonder why, goes after Donziger. And he's in court and he is held, he's charged but not convicted of contempt because he refuses to hand over to the judge his telephone and laptop, right? Which is a pretty standard thing to refuse to do because it violates attorney-client privilege. And then he's under house arrest. It's been over 650 days and he's under house arrest for a longer period of time than a lawyer in New York has ever been incarcerated for contempt charges. And 68 Nobel laureates have signed a letter demanding his release. He hasn't even been, his trial, this is another good sign of how lacking in integrity it is. During his trial, the judge, who is part of the Federalist Society, which, no offense, Emily, but
I'm not part of the Federalist Society.
I know, I'm just covering my bases. She is reading a newspaper during the trial, just to give you a sense of how seriously she's taking it. And, he was deprived. His lawyers were removed from the case right before scheduled day in court. He was not allowed to Zoom the trial. And it's just become a joke. And he actually is. I mean, he's facing jail time, which would be incredible. I mean, it's also a sign, I think, of how enabled and how Chevron never faces consequences for what it does, which is why they're, I think, comfortable doing something which in a just society would be such a bad PR move, right? Like prosecuting and persecuting a lawyer who won a judgment for people and these people got cancer, right? These people in Ecuador got cancer. And another thing that's really outrageous about the trial is that the judge, the Manhattan prosecutor, declined to prosecute him. And the judge appointed a private firm with ties to Chevron to prosecute him, which is unprecedented. I think it's happened one time or something before. But it's it's outrageous. And if we had a media that, that did its job, then I think Chevron would be too ashamed to do this. At least it would probably do it in a more subtle way behind the scenes.
Well, and government would feel more pressure to act. And that's what I think is particularly outrageous about this story, but so many other stories that it happens all the time. You see media basically acting as the PR firms in concert with the PR firms, basically, of these powerful companies and power brokers to help them enhance their own power at the cost to people, that have less power to begin with. And so it is like this weird situation, not weird, actually, it's very common. It's unfortunate,
right?
But you have the powerful in media, in business, and in government acting in concert to shield themselves.
Right. And so there's no chance of it getting out in any way, let alone, I was going to say in any fair way, but luckily for Chevron, it doesn't even get out at all outside of, independent media. And I also think that it's really important to bear in mind that this is Donziger has a lot of allies, right? He has a lot of high-profile allies. He has two amazing lawyers, one of whom actually just published a letter asking the judge to remove herself from the case because of all these conflicts of interest. He is someone who is visible because he helped win. He was part of a legal team. He didn't do it himself, and he's very conscious and make sure to emphasize that he was working with other Ecuadorian lawyers. But here's someone who's high profile. Imagine how much worse, if it's possible, but Chevron is, and these powerful corporations are, when it's someone who has no kind of access to high profile lawyers or high profile celebrities who are advocating for him, or Nobel laureates, right? So usually we don't even know about this stuff because the person is just so crushed. Right. And in this case, he is, again, Nobel laureates, and it still is ignored.
And this is now on the Biden administration, because now that Biden is president, it's a Democratic Department of Justice. And so these are prosecutors who are working for a Democratic administration. Do you have any sense if the Biden administration is feeling pressure on this question? Because they can't necessarily fire the judge.
Right.
But as the Department of Justice, they can influence this in a positive direction.
Well, what's interesting is that Steve has said that Donziger has said that he's the only person being prosecuted who wants the Department of Justice to prosecute him. He actually wants them to take over, so he has a fair hearing. And so they are, they present evidence, and he's allowed to present counter evidence. And it's because it's just become such a kangaroo court. So again, I think it's a really good sign of how ridiculous this case is when you have someone who's basically begging the Department of Justice to prosecute him.
Right.
And an obvious question, but I think one that you can shed light on, is why you talked about this earlier, the media sort of is intimidated by publicists for Chevron or whomever is working at Chevron that is pushing a certain narrative. Why are journalists responsive to that pressure in 2021, right? Like, what is it? You mentioned access earlier, but why is that so important to them when it comes to a story that has obvious and major news value like this one? Why is the cost-benefit analysis for those editors and those producers over at CNBC or wherever, why are they so responsive to that pressure?
Well, I think that, there's... Again, what we see is this guy is under house arrest, right? Which gives you a sign of how powerful these companies are. They're huge donors, so they have a lot of financial sway, and they also have obviously the legal, they have legal power to go after people. And I think that the Federalist Society, for instance, gets funding from Chevron. And I think, so there are all these conflicts of interest that also are reflected in legacy media.
I bet Chevron sponsors some of those morning newsletters. I bet they do.
No, they do.
Yeah.
They do.
Yeah.
They do for sure.
Ryan, do you know? I realized that I forgot to. I was so outraged about the story that I kind of forgot to look to cover the media connections. But Ryan, you probably know that.
Yes. No,
from Intercept. You could shed light on that.
Right,
Sorry to ask you the question.
Yeah. No, for sure. You're correct. They're a huge commercial funder of legacy media. Across the board. New York, DC. The fossil fuel industry generally pumps an absolutely extraordinary amount of money, and it's a cartel. These are, it's a cartel without being a cartel. These major companies all have the same interests, and they ally with each other on a lot of causes, but they also do their own individual advertising.
I just Googled, you can just go down the list here. Politico Playbook presented by Chevron. Politico Playbook presented by Chevron.
Right.
There you go. Right. Yeah. Again, and it's like, they don't even have to hide it.
Right.
And another thing that happens, and we've talked about this before on Rising, is, it doesn't have to be that Chevron sends people a letter, right? Or like edits a script. It's just, there's a lot of kind of like, it's almost like an evolutionary thing where, people self-censor. They know that they shouldn't go there. They know that. And in fact, the reason they've risen to the top is because they're willing to do things like that. So, there may not be this big smoking gun, although who knows, there probably is with these guys. I mean, I don't know. But there may not be a big smoking gun, but we know that there's a lot of self-censorship, and we know that people feel pressure not to upset their bosses, right? And again, what's so incredible to me is, like, even if you love Chevron and hate Donziger for whatever reason, because I guess you like cancer-causing products released into water, it is so undeniably newsworthy. You know what I mean? Like, there is a lawyer in his house under house arrest who has an ankle monitor on, who's been there for over 650 days. I mean, you have to you actually have to make a very conscious decision not to cover it.
Right, and you don't need a script delivered to you by Chevron if you're not going to cover it to begin with. Much easier to
that's true.
Ignore it.
Right.
Katie Halper, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
We'll be back with more Rising after this.